Welcome to the Creative Condition podcast, an ongoing series of conversations and considerations to help people understand and embrace their own unique creativity for fulfilling lives and brilliant careers. My name is Ben Talon. I'm an illustrator and author, and I bring 16 years of creative industry experience working with the New York Times, The Guardian, the Premier League, and more. And I invite designers, artists, psychologists, scientists, coaches, athletes, sensitivity experts, and all kinds of thought leaders to help us broaden our knowledge of creativity. Creativity is a fundamental pillar of human happiness, a vital ingredient in the solutions to our problems, but so often misunderstood. The show is supported by founding sponsor and B Corp, Illustration X. Take a look at their stunning range of illustrators and animators at illustrationx.com. If you like the music for the show, it's by Dirty Freud, who you can listen to now on Spotify and all good music streaming services.
But if we think of it more like a farmer's market where we're going directly to the artists, we're paying them directly, we're knowing where our culture comes from and having a direct line to it, I think that would be much healthier. And it's more interesting when you do have that interaction with the artist, when you know where they're coming from, how they're developing their career, like maybe they're geographically closer to you. Just simply put, go do something, go connect with someone, go seek out the sources of what you like, and everything will be better.
Today I'm joined by the New Yorker staff writer Kyle Chayka. Kyle is the author of Filterworld, How Algorithms Flattened Culture, and we're going to be getting into all things internet, algorithm, the impact on art, well-being and culture, and what it means, what we can do about it, and where do we go from here. This is the Creative Condition. Hello, how are you doing, guys? I hope you're well. My name is Ben Talon. I am your host. This is the Creative Condition. Welcome back. If you're a regular listener, it's a joy to have you as ever. And hello, you new lovelies. How are you? I hope you're good. This show is growing at the moment, so if you are new, welcome. Thank you very much. It really means a lot. This is my life's cause, championing creativity, fighting for the elevation of it in our society in the midst of a mental health crisis. We're going to need it for our collective global problems. So that means a lot, and it means a lot to have you here. So thank you. The show, as ever, is supported by the wonderful founding sponsor, Illustration X. Been represented by these guys as an illustrator now for a long time, but it is their work and their appreciation of broader culture that endears them to me, and we have a lovely mutual love of all that and the need to support the industry at large if we are to sustain our careers and our love of creativity. So check them out, illustrationx.com, for all their global range of illustration and animation portfolios now. So how are you guys? I hope you're well. I'm very excited about today's episode. Coming off the back of a solo ramble, I hope you enjoyed that. I find that sometimes they can be received slightly less well in terms of numbers than my guest episodes, but I do need a little circuit breaker here and there when I do this show weekly, and it takes a lot of personal and creative investment to produce the shows. As you know, I do a highlight edition. I do a full-length edition for people who've got the time to listen to 90 minutes of conversation, and I also do a what we learned about creativity recap, just to bag it up, just to put a bow on it and send you away with some, even if you just write down the 5 tips every week, I think it is going to improve your creativity and your understanding of it. So I hope you enjoy that format, but it does take a lot, so I do have to throw in the little solo rambles every now and again. That said, I often think they're going to be quicker and a little easier to do, but I do still have to write them and prepare them and research them, so there's no way around it. I'm here, I'm weekly, I'm giving you a lot. So I ask one thing of you in return: tell somebody. That's my new brief. I always say, can you go and rate, review and subscribe to the show? That does help. But what is even more valuable, if you wouldn't mind, is just to tell somebody. If you enjoy what I'm doing, if you like a specific episode like today's show with Kyle Chayka, please just take a moment to go and tell one person. WhatsApp a mate. Tell them in person at the pub. Email them and say, look, I'm loving this podcast. Check it out. It needs your support. And it is really cool. You're going to learn a lot about creativity. If you could do that for me, guys, that would really mean the world, because I know as a prolific podcast listener myself, I don't always take the action to support the shows that I love when I should. In fact, I'm going to do that this week as a little Kickstarter for some podcast karma. I'm going to go and do it on my wrestling podcast. I'm going to go and review them, and I'm going to go and tell a mate who's a wrestling fan that they should listen, because we get complacent, don't we, with all this sheer ubiquity of content that it's just going to be there every week. But the truth is, these shows, it takes a lot of hard work to produce. Anyway, that said, I hope you enjoyed Joanna Henley coming back to the show for the third time a couple of weeks ago. Carlos Moreno before that, talking about the 15-minute city, urban development and design, how that can really help communities and creativity. I loved that show a lot. Carlos was a joy to talk to, and I hope you did too, and I hope you've gone and got his book, 15-Minute City, and I hope you've got my book, first and foremost. No, I'm joking. Choose either. It's all for the greater good of creativity. But of course, there is now the Creative Condition book. It is available, signed paperback editions, along with a bundle deal right now. bentalentwriter.com/shop if you want the Anatomy of Creativity map and the book for £22. Go and do it. I spent 10 years writing that thing. Cheers, guys. So without further ado, Kyle Chayka is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He is their eye on the internet. He's wonderful. I love talking to Kyle. We met at Cannes Lion Festival when we were part of TBWA's Disruption panel, along with Jan Costello and incoming global CEO who was on the show a few episodes ago, Erin Riley, an absolute joy. And Kyle was a part of the panel along with Lucia Aniello, who is a director, Emmy Award-winning director in the States, and they were talking about the state of things, the flattening of culture that Kyle so beautifully documents in his wonderful book, Filterworld, How Algorithms Flattened Culture. I would recommend it to anybody. It is equal parts fascinating, inspiring, and depressing, because some of the stuff we're going to get talking about today is a little depressing and upsetting. Maybe depressing is the wrong word. It just knocks your spirits a little bit, because we are in an algorithmic void at the moment, and there is so much passable meh level creativity that is being signed off because of AI and about the amalgamation of everything on the internet. And it requires a little bit of hard work to go out there and find your voice and to push that, but it is still the most valuable thing, and that's what Kyle and I are going to be talking about today. So you can check out Filterworld, and I highly recommend you do. It's going to be on when I finish the Creative Condition website, which I have started and is looking lovely at the moment. It's going to be ready by the end of this year. I hope to launch in January. I'm going to have a library. I'm going to have a Creative Condition reading list where I put all these books that I come across that have helped me in some way learn about creativity. And it's going to be on there along with Kyle's other book, The Longing for Less, Living with Minimalism. So that's the other one. And that book, The Longing for Less, deconstructs the contemporary fascination with minimalism, analysing Marie Kondo cleaning boom and austere Instagram aesthetics, as well as uncovering the roots of our fascination with absence in art, architecture, music and philosophy. Also a brilliant book. Kyle's a very, very talented guy, and I loved having him on this show. I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. Get me your feedback, please. Got a new email, ben@bentalent.com, or you can get me on the old one, hello@bentalent.com. They go to the same place, but I got told spam filters don't like hello addresses, so I've now got a Ben one. So feel free to indulge me on that one. I'm on socials on LinkedIn predominantly. I spend less time on Instagram, but I am on there using it regularly still, so you can message me. But if you want the quickest response, hit me on the email. Kyle and I are talking about the kind of love for email and newsletters and the early internet today, so I am trying to go back to that. I'm trying to go back to a more personal conversation. I love hearing from you guys, so please do hit me up on the email. You probably hear from me the quickest there, or LinkedIn. Big thank you again, illustrationx.com, and please do support the wonderful Ukrainian Institute, ui.org.ua. They're supporting the Ukrainian creative community. I was delighted this week. You'll remember my episode with Olya Protasova, who is a incredibly brave and inspiring Ukrainian illustrator, designer and design activist who I had on the show to share the story of creativity in times of war. Olya shared with me the most beautiful news, as did Stefan, as in Stefan Sagmeister, that Now Is Better is now a living, breathing book in the Ukraine, in Ukrainian. And I can't tell you how much joy that gives me, how much inspiration that those people who have to worry about bombs falling have actually found the fortitude and the resilience to go and publish a beautiful book on creativity and about why now is arguably as good a time to live as ever before for human beings. That's balls for you. Go and check that out. It's a really, really inspiring story. It's on. You'll see it on my LinkedIn. Right, that's enough. Enjoy this conversation with New Yorker staff writer and author Kyle Chayka. Well, I thought a nice place to start might be early internet. I'm interested in your experience. I don't think we're too far apart in age. I think you're a little younger than me. I'm 41. I'm not asking for your age, by the way.
Yeah, I'm 36 now. So
yeah. But I loved in your book, your stories of finding these little microcosms of people who were also interested in the things that you were interested in. And somebody asked me this week, actually, someone asked, what was if you can remember, what was the first thing you searched for when you got the internet? And I think mine might have been WWF pictures. I'm a massive wrestling fan to this day. And I just remember being wowed by these really slow loading, images, really poor quality, but it was just magic. So let's talk about your early internet experience, because it sounds very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the earliest things I can remember accessing on the internet was really the AOL interface. Like in the US, at least, I don't know about in the UK, how we got online was America Online, and that was the dial-up system that just existed. You would get those compact discs in the mail and then load them up on your computer and go through the shrill dial-up tone and get online. And then what you were faced with once you got online was not like the open internet per se, but was this kind of welcome window of AOL with different banners to go to the kids section or the finance section or the game section. And that was really where I started, I think. I mean, the kids section had its own, little games and puzzles and news, probably with Nickelodeon updates and cartoons and stuff. I remember playing a lot of, basic computer graphic games and going in chat rooms and all of that. But I think gradually I did figure out how to just get onto the rest of the internet, that you could type in a URL or you could find Google and then you could load other stuff. So I think what did I look for? I mean, probably at that point, like video games and anime, basically, like the classic, late 90s, early 2000s internet content. that was a lot of it. I mean, it was all fan forums, right? It was people developing their own little communities around what they were interested in and running it themselves. And I think that's what you end up falling into, is these little groups of people.
Yeah, I think that's where the magic was for me. It was that classic community thing and finding new tribes. And that's, and this touches upon the whole human curation aspect of what you've been writing about. And maybe that was subconscious. It probably was, to be honest. Most things were as a teenager. I don't think we had much of a grasp on anything consciously. But I do remember, yes, loving the images, loving the fact that this stuff was here for me to look at. But who'd done that? Who'd put that there? Who'd written that caption? It all mattered.
Yes. I mean, it was a much more direct person-to-person connection at that point, given that nothing was online unless someone did a lot of work to put it there. So there was no feed per se. There was no, algorithmic recommendation of what you wanted to see. There was just what you could find and what you tried to look up on your own. So that's the forums that you found, or the chat rooms, or the fan websites that collected images of Dragon Ball Z or something. Like it was much more like a treasure hunt, I think, where you did have to find your way to somewhere new and different. And it was pretty difficult. I mean, the culture of the internet, I think, was not mainstream at that point. And just the experience of talking to people online and participating in those communities was not a universal thing.
Yeah, so there was this, an attractive scarcity about it, wasn't there? And you got stories from it too that you could take back into the real world and, pass along.
Yeah, you could share where you got to on the internet. You could
Yeah,
point out a new website to people, or you could connect with your friends on the internet and kind of cultivate this secondary life or connection or relationship with people digitally rather than
yeah,
physically. And that, there's always been letters and email and, chat messages. Like the chat is the most fundamental element of the internet, I feel like. But felt like there was something new, or there has been something new about this like digital or virtual life that you cultivate online, and that you can be whoever you want. In some ways you can express yourself in a way that you can't in real life. And that was part of the charm of the early internet, I think, because it's like that old New Yorker cartoon where the caption, the image is a dog at a computer desk talking to a cat, and on the caption is, on the internet no one knows that you're a dog. And that's it. Like, that's, at that time, you didn't put a photo of yourself on the internet. You didn't use an avatar that was you. You used a cartoon or a random selected image from AIM, and your username was not your real name at all. And so it felt like this different kind of space. Whereas now, of course, our real lives, our real identities, and our online identities are essentially the same.
that's very true. One of the reasons I got accepted into art college was because my email at the time was your new hero at AOL.com, which they found the funniest. It was wrestling inspired, of course, but it was, I never quite made it to realize at that age that people who didn't like wrestling or watch wrestling would get the irony and just thought I was a massive dick. And it's kind of, but it got me, they just laughed so much that it kind of endeared me, and that was lovely. So yeah, there is that.
Yeah, you cultivate like a persona, or I don't know, as an art student too. It's like you could find an art community online, and you could upload your work and like express yourself in that way, like express your interests with your email address or your website or your blog.
That's very true. That was massive actually. And
I mean, if you
GeoCities,
remember, like, yeah, GeoCities pages, like every artist or every aspiring artist had a GeoCities page of like blurry JPEGs of their paintings. Or, I always remember, this is maybe my most obscure internet experience, but in the 2000s, there was this genre of forum called Oekaki BBS, which was like bulletin board system. And it was this Japanese thing where people would just draw in the forum on the very basic kind of MS Paint software in the forum, and then post their drawings. And the forum was mostly images. And I spent so much time on this, like making drawings in the forum and posting them and commenting on other people's, like that. I don't think there's any equivalent of that today.
it's really simple. It's really simple, but it's very, that does sound appealing actually.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it now, it sounds radical. like you're not drawing your own things on Instagram within Instagram, or Tumblr was a bit more like that, but even that has kind of fallen by the wayside. Like, yeah, I do think over time too, all of these platforms and experiences online have become more generic, and it's like posting on X or Twitter is the same as Facebook, is the same as Instagram. Like you put the same stuff everywhere, and it all kind of melds together.
Yeah, I think you're right. The Instagram chasing TikTok, and yeah, because Instagram was cherished by my industry in particular. We loved that. We loved the aesthetic. We loved that there was less noise there, and it was about imagery. And the moment the moment if you were looking on your phone late at night, you had to worry about hitting the mute button as quickly as possible. That lost a big thing for me. There's a big loss for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the biggest problems of the internet, I think, is you can't preserve how something works or what it looks like. So regardless of how you felt about Instagram in 2013 or something, that's never coming back. Like, you're never going to regain that environment. You can't have it just be images anymore. Like, you have to deal with the videos and the advertising and the recommendations. Whereas, I don't know, if you compare it to something like Flickr, which was another big thing of the 2000s internet, that was just a service to post your images, and there was basic social sharing and accounts, and that never really changed, though it kind of got run into the ground. Like, no, that's not a serious social platform anymore. But yeah, it just goes to show, like, the uses of the platform are always shifting, and what you use it for today is not necessarily what you're going to be using it for in a year or 2 years, let alone 5 years or 10 years.
I had an idea. I write quite a lot of short fiction in my own time, and I had an idea for a seed of an idea, at least, for a story, and it would be the community of people who are exactly in the, I guess, this space of dissatisfaction that we're going to talk about in Filterworld, but it's almost hacker-esque, have broken back into these old internet graveyards, be that GeoCities, places that have still got hit counters, and there's still the kind of ruins of what was on there, but it's all kind of mashed up. When people have tried to garner the ruins of what was there, and you can't quite get it back, but you can get just enough back to see what it might have looked like. I just like the idea that people that are hanging out, they're now in their 50s, or even a younger generation too, and they're hanging around in these spaces through digital interfaces while the noise and the politics is happening everywhere. I thought there was something appealing about that anyway.
Yeah, you can still find the relics in a way. Like, there are mirrors of GeoCities where you can see what it looked like, and Tumblr still exists in a not so degraded format. And really, you can post wherever you want online. Like, you can go and have an entire social experience in the comment thread of an obscure blog that no one ever looks at anymore. And that will still be essentially the same as going on Facebook. Like, you can still interact with people in whatever way you want, but the culture has moved on. It's like, you need the community, you need the active users in order to make something happen on the internet, and that's hard to do. Particularly when it's so easy to have the social experience on Instagram mostly, or TikTok. Like, the path of least resistance is always where the most people are going to go.
So Filterworld, you focus on culture with this idea. So I'd love to touch upon the culture in your youth. Like, what did that look like pre-internet in particular? Because I remember I had to work bloody hard for my very limited cultural horizons. A lot of walking to shops to buy magazines and newspapers, a lot of real life discussion and gleaning recommendations. And I look for that now. I cherish that to this day. What did your cultural horizons look like?
Yeah, I think they were not very wide. I mean, I grew up in suburban Connecticut, kind of in the woods, a little too far from New York City. I had no sense of, like, a cosmopolitan lifestyle or high culture, let's say, until high school, probably. But where I found the most new things, I mean, one was always the internet for me, having been on it since I was, you know, 10 or 11, probably. I don't even know. But then it was, I mean, the library. Literally, I checked out a history of modern art book from the library that really changed my life, because I didn't know about modern art, basically. And Blockbuster, really. I think Blockbuster was the unsung hero of everyone's cultural consumption at that time, where you could, there was a Blockbuster in the plaza, a 10-minute drive from my childhood home, next to the big grocery store that we went to. So you could go into the Blockbuster and browse all of the new movies and rent a video game system, like rent an N64, see what games were out. And that's where I kind of understood that art films were a thing, or independent cinema or foreign films were a thing. And that also expanded to theaters. I mean, I think in the pre-streaming worlds, like the indie theater, the art house theater, was a gathering place for people who are interested in that kind of culture. And it's the only way you can consume something that's new and obscure and innovative. Like when you don't live in a major city and you're not exposed to that stuff more ambiently, you have to go seek it out. And for me, that was in the form of, driving 45 minutes to an art house cinema that might be playing Sofia Coppola or something. I don't know. So that those were like the sources of new things in my cultural life, as well as like art museums. And there's a great contemporary art museum in Connecticut that I did a after school program at in high school. And that really introduced me to the idea of an art world and a curator and a museum director and all of that, the whole kind of industry around visual art. For everything that wasn't physically around me, that was the internet. Like that's where I found indie music and pirated anime and Korean MMORPGs. Like that was everyone could access the same stuff online. Like it didn't matter what train line you were next to, and if you couldn't drive into New York, the internet gave you everything.
It's funny you mentioned Blockbuster. Right? That was my second part-time job. And let me tell you, the social currency that job brought about was incredible. I'd gone from a real bottom end supermarket, like a budget supermarket job, stacking shelves, tidying up, and dealing with eccentrics, which has its own merits, but that's another story. But I then got a gig for twice the money at Blockbusters, and I was one of 7 staff, and we got 7 free rentals a week as part of working there. Man. But the best thing was that everyone was friends that worked there, so everyone overrode that and just didn't check it out on the system. So it was kind of unlimited. And then you get friends coming in and kind of nicking off your free rentals. But what was best about it was, on a busy Saturday when people come in there and it's everyone in town, it's coming for their film or their game, and they place this great trust in that curation, and your little thing, your little discovery of, you mentioned Korean there, we'd get a lot of Asian films in there, and just whatever it was, that quirky little comedy that you come across and just chimed with you somehow, when you could sell that back to a customer and have a face-to-face conversation, not only was it incredibly empowering for us as staff, but then you'd see these people on nights out and they'd be like, oh, it's the guy from Blockbuster, come over here, and it just, there was something about that little community that it created.
Wow. Yeah, you were the town hero kind of, or like you were, it's like the archetypal record store employee, except I feel like Blockbuster was friendlier. Like you kind of couldn't be so pretentious or so mean because it's a Blockbuster. Like you have to get people the big movie that they're looking for. But people trust you. They trust that person who sits at the counter and should know everything about what's in the store and can give you a good romantic comedy recommendation or an action movie and just like guide you to what might be good for you to consume. And I do think, that's how a great bookstore works, or even a great art gallery. Like there should be that human relationship and that sense of human taste to like guide you into trying something new. And I love that, like the heroic quality of that's the Blockbuster guy. Like we all know and trust him to recommend us our new movies. It's like that's a trusted figure in the community. Like that's a role that's very important, and I feel like it's really gone missing as so much IRL exchange of culture has given way to just online consumption and recommendations.
Well, yeah, you go in cafes now and you get a QR code instead of being able to ask someone about the food or the coffee, and it's kind of, we don't want that much from machines, Convenience is healthy for all of us to a certain extent, but when it's at the loss of, I mean, let's face it, that's what is culture? Culture is maybe it's the illustration of the fact that we need more than just to be surviving as human beings, is it not?
Yes, I think I always remember an art history professor of mine at university. I was kind of deciding whether or not to major in art history, which I ultimately didn't. I have a minor in art history, but she said, art history doesn't necessarily change the world. Like this is not politics or whatever, but art history is like what makes life worth living. And so that's why it's so worthwhile. I mean, it's not live or die. You're not going to die without it, but it's everything is kind of empty without that sense of good cultural consumption and like a sense of identification with the culture you consume. Like we develop really strong ties to the things that we love, whether it's movies or fashion or books or music. And I think the internet and like digital streaming platforms has kind of abstracted that away, and removed some of our closeness with that stuff.
I grew up and my dad was very into film memorabilia, still is. And they're not so prevalent now. They're hard to find, but he would go to big conferences and big film fairs. And, the wall of BO when you walked in those places was something else. It was just people who their culture was everything to the point of a loss of personal hygiene. And that's the level I want when it comes to my culture.
The obsession.
But he was reflecting on that recently, and they're only few and far between, and now they're kind of bunged in with comics and Marvel and the big films and everything else. Whereas there used to be, you could get some really nerdy stuff there. I'm talking, negatives from obscure films and all that stuff. But I've always been fascinated and magnetized to those subcultures and those gatherings and those belongings. It doesn't matter what it is. I love seeing other people do their thing too. Do you think that was still prevalent on the early internet? Because it certainly felt to me like it was.
Yeah, I mean, people gathered in smaller, more specific communities, I think. Like the fan forums, even digital storefronts in the early days, like eBay or something. Like there was ways of congregating around a niche interest and building community around it in a very nice way, I think. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know, it makes me think about how at some point the internet provided more of a impetus to bring things offline, to like go meet your internet friends or like go to a conference or whatever. Like the internet was the gateway to a real life experience or an offline relationship in some way. And now it just seems like reality has become more online rather than vice versa. like now that the online experience is the point. Like that's where everything happens and that's where it stays. So you might have these really close ties on TikTok or develop a really strong parasocial relationship with an influencer or something, but it doesn't go beyond that as much. And I do think lately we're seeing this like desire, especially post COVID, for in-person experiences, whether that's like concerts or live podcast recordings or just parties and gatherings around a subject that might be drawn from the internet, or that's where you mostly experience it, but then you go and be there in person and experience it together. So I feel like that makes me slightly more hopeful that it's still what people want. People still want to be together and experience something in person.
They do, and it seems like it's starting to warm up again now. I am noticing that more and more, which is healthy, and we do need that. It's an evolutionary thing to be valued for who we truly are, and it's it gave us a better chance of survival in smaller groups. That's where that emanates from, which I learned recently from a professor at Arizona. This year's array of podcast guests has been rather broad, which has been wonderful for learning little nuggets like that. But yeah, it gives you identity, and I find it crushingly sad when people diminish the value of making an artwork, anything that they post on the internet. And if it doesn't get the ultimate, the golden engagement, whatever it might be, that it somehow invalidates. And this is not limited. When I say that, my imagination conjures images of maybe fragile teenage people who haven't had the time to build their identity and their resilience yet. But just last week, I interviewed friend Stephen Bliss, he pioneered the art style for Grand Theft Auto video games. He was the senior artist at Rockstar for many years. And he does his own work now. And I asked him about a project he was working on when we last had a conversation for the show back in 2017. It was these incredible kind of wall-sized collages of New York ripped subway posters. And it was called I, Frankenstein. He would put them back together and draw back into them and create them and make them his own thing. And part of the reason he'd stopped doing that was the lack of love on Instagram. And I found that crushingly sad. And, that spoke to a kind of, I guess it's what Stephen wanted to get back from the project, and almost wanted the validation for it. But I was in love with that work. And I found it sad that even played the smallest part, in that decision.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who creates things nowadays, whether you're writing or drawing or painting or doing a podcast or posting your comedy sketches on TikTok, like the engagement is almost a threat. Like you are anxiously awaiting the response for whatever it is that you do. I mean, even like I post little drawings of my own on Instagram of landscape sketches or whatever. I'm still like, oh no, this one only got 20 likes, when this is so not my thing at all. Like, this is something I'm just doing for love and a hobby essentially. But you're still encouraged to judge it by how people engage with it on the internet. And I mean, it's so unhealthy in terms of people's creative careers and just the kind of work that they make. I mean, in Filterworld, the book, I interviewed my friend Hallie Bateman, who's a great illustrator and writer. And she talks about how she started the series on her Instagram account of just little kind of self-instructions scribbled on construction paper and torn up a bit. Super powerful, visually simple, mimetic pattern. And it did so well on Instagram that she felt like that was the only thing she could do. And she got so many new followers for them, who then got mad that she was posting other stuff. like they were annoyed that they weren't just getting the one kind of art that they expected to get on this account. And that's, I mean, so absurd to expect that an artist or a creative person is just going to hit the same note forever, to keep doing the thing that you like, and that their account will just deliver that ingredient to your feed. It's much more consumerist, I think, rather than wanting to see what the artist creates, rather than wanting to follow their creative thoughts, you're instead just consuming the product that they have become known for, which is sad, because if you like an artist, any kind of artist, you should want to know where their brain goes, not what you want from them. Like in this case, these big collages and stuff, ultimately, who cares how many likes they get, or who cares who likes them? Hopefully, because the artist likes them, it's leading them somewhere, and they can keep pursuing that. But that's a bit, I mean, in the art world, that kind of work is enabled by curators and dealers and collectors. Like, the art world is not a numbers game and never has been, except for the price tag. You need a very small number of people to support you in order to make very radical work. So as long as, the right 10 or 20 people appreciate your work, that's enough. You don't need 100,000 fans on Instagram. But I hope, there's that famous 1,000 true fan theory of the internet, where as long as you can find the 1,000 people who like your work enough to pay $100 a year for it, then you're good. And I hope that everyone can find those 1,000 people for what they truly want to do, not just what people expect of them.
Yeah, that's the thing. I remember the minor backlash to the Arctic Monkeys sort of second and third albums as they started to evolve as a band because they'd created such a, fierce identity in the first album. They had real currency and voice at the time, and people hated that he wasn't that again. And he's like, well, like you said, it's like, no, come on, I don't want the same. That's beautiful, but I'll always have that album now. That's permanent. That's been made. That's for us. So what's next? I want something exciting and new. And I've always adored the work of Damon Albarn for that reason, because he's just continually evolved and stayed present for, cutting edge for 30 odd years.
Right. That's the ideal. Like that's what an art career should be ideally, or if that's what the artist wants, they should keep evolving and keep making new stuff and responding to the era that they're in. Like, I think people have this expectation that art stays the same, or that it's just supposed to follow their own tastes and be comfortable for them. And I think, a larger theory of mine is that people have just turned away from that role of art as challenging. Like they don't want to be challenged by the culture they consume. They would rather just get more generic Spotify recommendations and, float along on the easy path of average stuff than actually seek out a cultural experience that makes them uncomfortable or shocks them or challenges them.
And it is very easy. I've been guilty of it for sure. Spotify is the great example. It's, God, I maybe I'll go out of my comfort zone, and then it doesn't take too long to come running back to a familiar album. In fairness, I was doing that with my CD collection too, but it certainly heightens and amps up that effect. Do you think there's a degree of just a massive aspect of too much with all of this? As in, yes, the algorithms are kind of feeding things, but we're so overwhelmed as sensitive creatures that the passivity that you talk about in the book is going to happen because our brains aren't designed to handle so much information.
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely critique that kind of passive consumption in the book, and I don't think it's ideal for consumers or for creators of culture. But you have to ask, why do we seek out this generic, comfortable, average stuff? And that is maybe because we feel so overwhelmed by everything else that we consume. Like, we feel overwhelmed by the accelerated news cycles that we experience. We feel overwhelmed by the chaotic era we seem to live in. We feel overwhelmed by the whirlwind economic conditions that no one understands or predicts. And thus, who has the energy to be challenged by culture and to have new and different thoughts? Like, all we want to do is rewatch The Office on Netflix or something. It's a lot of things are comfort food, I think, and people aren't as driven to expand their horizons, or even, the larger problem to me is that the ecosystem doesn't necessarily reward what's truly innovative. And it's what most often succeeds is the kind of generic and average stuff that stays within a lane. And there's less room for a human curator or tastemaker or just a new platform to come in and bring something new for all of us. It's the ecosystem is dominated by monopolistic tech companies. There's less room for that record label executive or librarian or curator to reach out and highlight something that's totally new and different. And thus we're all slightly poorer for that.
Was there a tipping point? Was there a point at which you felt that you were ready to commit to this book? Because it's, there's a hell of a lot of admirable research in this book. And it was, I imagine, my guess would be that they were this, as someone who was around from the start of the internet, that this was probably a slow build. But was there a tipping point as such, or any moment that you can remember that made you think there's a book in this, and I need to write this thing?
This is my second book. So writing a book takes a very long time and is like a huge commitment, obviously. So, as with my first book, but I think before you write the book or before you sell it, particularly in the publishing industry, you kind of have to know that there's enough there. Like there's a certain point at which you think, okay, there's enough here to write an entire book about, to sustain 6 or 8 chapters and 300 pages of stuff. There's more than an article. There's more that I have to say, and more background and more research and everything else. And I think that happens. I mean, it happens mostly. I had been thinking through these ideas since 2015 or 2016, this idea of digital platforms homogenizing culture. And I think by 2019, 2020, I was pretty firmly convinced that this was a real thing. like culture had only seemed to become more homogenous, and our experiences more flattened by the internet in that period of 2016 to 2020. And I mean, I think the internet had also changed a lot. Like, I think in the mid 2010s, we didn't know where things were going necessarily. In 2015, 2016, Facebook still seemed to be kind of utopian. Like, Instagram was only popular since 2 years ago. Like, this was all new and fresh, and like a world we were figuring out as we went. And I think by 2019, 2020, it was clear you could make a substantive critique of how the internet had not turned out so well. Like, there were clear problems in what was going on, and there was this growing animosity toward the homogenous, oppressive quality of social networks. So I think at that point, I was fairly convinced that there was enough to write a book about. There was enough evidence that algorithmic recommendations and feeds were flattening culture and were making our experiences worse. And then I still had this skepticism almost that the problems would continue. Like, like maybe they would fix the algorithms. Maybe everything would change, from 2019 to 2023. Like, I worried that the problems I was talking about would become less relevant, but it turned out they were not. Like, it turned out if the internet was already kind of cresting and getting worse circa, starting in 2017, 2018, it's only gotten worse and worse and worse at this point. Like, TikTok has accelerated all of these problems. If anything, Facebook is more or less irrelevant to most creative people. Twitter has now become X, and under Elon Musk has essentially been broken. So I think what happened has borne out my hypotheses in the book, thankfully. And I never could have predicted the timing, but the timing was great. Like, I think people really started to identify algorithmic recommendations as a problem in a bigger way in the last year or two. And there's this growing sense of dissatisfaction with them.
Andy Sandoz, who was a creative director in the UK, quite a big agency, and I had an interview with him. And I remember him asking me, he was kind of at a loss to explain why. This was in 2015, I think. No, it wasn't. It was 2017. And he said, why now, when we have access to all of human history in some way, shape, or form, are we not seeing wilder acts of creativity? And and he said to me, "Where's the banshee whale?" And I think your book's kind of answered his question to me, because we're not having to look for it, and people are not, and people are, in terms of my industry, there's a lot of people talking about the age of convergence, people are calling it. And again, it's this, I saw a brilliant talk by a guy called Max Ottignon, who runs an agency called Ragged Edge. And some of his talk slides, he'd put, e-commerce websites, 30 of them next to each other. You couldn't tell them apart from a logo that was hard to tell apart from their competitors. And it's kind of, he was looking for the optimism, as in, here's an opportunity to do something really cool because of all this grey. But I think that answers Andy's question, is because we're served mediocrity, and it's just about good enough to sign off on. for agencies who just want to spend the least money they can to serve the purpose, as opposed to really push creativity and be original.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's less incentive to be original or creative when that doesn't get rewarded. Like, I mean, I think in the 90s or 2000s, there was a sense that if a bunch of really interesting people did something totally radical and new, it could survive and could be rewarded, and it wouldn't just be bludgeoned to death by the need to cultivate attention at every second. Like, even thinking back to MTV, even in the 2000s, where's MTV now? Or like, what is our MTV that's bringing us like new and radical culture in a mainstream way? It doesn't exist. Like, that brand identity and that sense of curation and embrace of youth culture is just totally gone. And I think you're right. Like, that sense of risk taking is not there, in part because people choose not to make it. But as we all know, with creative agencies, like, the problem is usually the client, not the studio. So people are less willing to take that risk and build something totally new and different, or to shock their consumers, to bring them somewhere new, to try out a new way of doing things. And everything just seems to be so templated, basically. Like, we figured out what forms work on the internet. An efficient, optimized e-commerce storefront, essentially. And then we just stamp that out infinitely. We'd replicate it, and it evolves in slight variations to find an even more optimized version of itself. And I don't know, it's like Darwinian capitalism or something. Like, you're just getting ever closer and closer to the most efficient form of attracting attention and capital. And that is absolutely not the best culture. Like, that's not the most fun or interesting thing. That's just the thing that's going to be most likely to compel you to hit the buy button. Like, the Amazon storefront is a machine to take money from you. It's not a machine to educate or inform or develop your creative sense. Like, and I think we've settled into the internet only being for that, only being for the attraction of attention and the turbo or accelerated consumption of as much content as possible. And that's bad for culture. That's like, I don't know, there's a really fascinating anecdote or thing that happened recently in music in the US, where this pretty unknown indie singer-songwriter, guitar player, musician released a new album, and they only released it as a 2-hour long YouTube video. There was no Spotify, there was no track listing even on the YouTube. Their website was a fake, like a faux GeoCities page. There were no TikTok videos, there were no interviews, there was no Instagram account. If you wanted to experience this album, all you could do is hit play on the 2-hour long YouTube and see what happened and see if you liked it. And to me, that's much more challenging and interesting and different than how we consume most things, which is it creates more friction. Like, most consumption experiences now are totally frictionless. You can flip to the next TikTok video, you can fast forward the YouTube, you can close out your tab. But that YouTube of the album demanded a different form of attention from you. And it required more of the user. And I think we should have more required of us. Like, we should have to work for it rather than just expect that we're going to get personalized and optimized content 24/7.
But it is a two-way relationship, isn't it? Otherwise, why are we creating culture? We do want debate, we do want friction, and we do. That's why I love that. I love that people hate albums that I love. If everybody liked it, I think it would kill it for me. I always remember I remember when Blur brought out Think Tank, the album, and I remember on the same day reading a 1-star and a 5-star review. And that's perfect because that's what I want. And over time that changes too. But it requires a long-term commitment to reach that place of becoming familiar with something truly familiar, which actually makes me think of a fantastic bit. And it was it? Oh content capital. Was that is that the term you used? So tell us about that a little bit, because that was ugly but very interesting.
Yeah, it was a very good term coined by an academic in a book that came out from MIT Press called Content. Just a great book, very distilled message. And content capital was this term for essentially how good you were at generating content. like not how good your art was or your music or your writing, but instead how well the content that thing generated performed. So not the thing itself, but the content that it generates. And it's just become such a good lens, I think, with which to look at culture, because so much is driven by how much attention and content you can generate or attract with a given thing. So I think it's very easy to see in book publishing right now, like the people with the most content capital have the easiest time selling their books. And that means the authors who already have strong social media followings, who already have active Instagram accounts where people relate to their face and voice, where consumers are attracted to follow this person, not just to read a book, but to identify and relate to the creator and their personal brands and their ongoing career or whatever. Because the personal brand, I think, is ultimately what it all comes down to. Like, that is where the capital is generated rather than the book itself. So instead of marketing the book, in a way, you're marketing the person. Instead of marketing the music, you're marketing the musician as a influencer, essentially. And I do think the ultimate outcome of that need for content capital is that every artist acts more and more like an influencer and not like an artist. So if the archetype of the artist was a person who hid away in their studio and worked for months or years on something totally radical and new and then showed it to the world, now it's like the artist is someone who posts get ready with me videos from their studio every day and like narrates their paintbrush collection and what jewelry they're wearing and what restaurant they're going out to tonight. Like, it's not about the art, it's about the lifestyle and how the lifestyle gets communicated on the internet, which I find depressingly accurate. I mean, everyone, again, who tries to get something made and distributed online faces that pressure to turn themselves into a commodity.
Yeah. I remember Noel Gallagher saying he was angry about it all, and he said I wanted to believe that David Bowie was from Mars. He said I didn't. I had no. He said I had no fucking interest whatsoever in what socks he was wearing or what he was having for breakfast.
Yeah, and that's so much what it's about. The thing that really drives this home for me is you go on TikTok and there are these great artists and musicians and designers doing videos about their work, explaining interesting ideas and talking about, their creative process. And all the comments are just like, where did you get your dress? What is that table? Like, what sunglasses are you wearing? What hotel are you staying at? It's like, that's not the point. That's not the point at all. Who cares? That's what people are so thirsty to know. What you had for breakfast. Like,
yeah.
What's your gym routine? What's your skincare product of choice? Like,
yeah.
And that's not who was anyone asking David Bowie what moisturizer he used? Like, yeah. I hope not. I hope that wasn't happening.
I remember somebody on a documentary asking Bowie if he had any interest in going to space, and he just said, "Oh God, no." He said, I have a hard enough time making it down the bottom of the garden most days."
Right, like that's the persona of the artist becomes more and more of a literal commodity, and like there's less room for that kind of wild or esoteric or weird figure as David Bowie was, or someone like Prince, or everything is just more literal and more visible these days. There's much less mystery of the person because you expect to be able to consume their entire life essentially.
And you mentioned it with the kind of influencers going to locations around the world and taking a photo with, with no sense of place, no deep connection to anywhere. And it's, yeah, it's that, but it's also that globalization is bad. I remember going to Hong Kong for the first time. Did a live job there, and I was slightly traumatized to see a Marks and Spencer's, like a British, supermarket there on the high street. I thought, oh God, no. When I go to another country, I want their culture. So I went about 3 streets off the front, and I found this little place behind like the bead curtains and not a word of English, which, and I had to try and navigate a menu with just the pictures, and I ended up I'm vegetarian, ended up with something with a lump of meat in the bottom, despite drawing a carrot and trying to use that as an illustration. But that was fantastic because that was all enrichment. That was all a story I could take away. It didn't matter, this had all happened, and that's what I wanted. And I wanted to lend myself to it a little bit. So, I had to run away from the Marks and Spencers to achieve that. But it's that's something as well.
Yeah, I mean, in travel, you also have to seek out the challenging experience. Like, it's so easy now to not be challenged, to not. You can just book the Airbnb or stay in your hotel or go to the Starbucks or go to the, generic fourth wave coffee shop where you can get your iced latte or whatever. And that means you're less exposed to the texture of a specific place. You're not as exposed to the fundamental difference of what is there. And if what you want to do is just consume the same stuff as you were at home, like why travel in the first place? It's not the new place is not just a new background for your Instagram stories. It's a different culture, it's a different history, it's a place with a different lifestyle that you can participate in. And that is important to experience. I mean, much like it's important to read a challenging book or listen to difficult music, it's important to go to a place and experience it for what it is rather than trying to make it what it's not or stay within your frame of reference.
Serving the expected again. Because that's the big danger of all this, isn't it? What you hit up on there was growth, personal and cultural growth. And if we lose that, and if we surrender completely to the expected and live these very surface deep lifestyles, I mean, I don't know how sustainable it is, because at some point, surely we have to sort of wake up and realize that this is not fulfilling and this is not fun, and we need more magic in our lives. Or are we that sedated? I don't know.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean,
But that's the
sedated is a
thing.
good word for it.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Because because ultimately we face a lot of problems in the world today, and we're going to need creativity and imagination and innovation to sort these things out. But if we're not seeking it and we're not getting it in the more leisurely forms, then that's a slippery slope.
Yes, for sure. I mean, where it's interesting to ask where personal growth comes from. Like, what motivates it, what helps you become a different person. And culture should perform that role, right? Like, that's a historical role of culture, of art and music and dance and whatever it is, to bring you to a different place, to confront you with a new self or a new experience that you never expected to love, but you do love. And that is it's discouraged, I think, in our ecosystem in a way. Like, we stay with what we're comfortable with. We don't want growth necessarily from the culture. We just want that numbing, continuous consumption, just more and more of the same stuff. But I don't know, like, now personal growth is like going to the gym or like, drinking smoothies for breakfast or something. It's much more the optimization of the self and like the decreasing the friction of life than it is about changing your philosophy or broadening your horizons. I don't know. That's definitely a subject I want to think more about, of like, what is the role of art now, and why does it seem like so much is not challenging and not moving us to a new place? Like, we want that experience of being moved by a work of art, of being changed, of having a new feeling, like you're a different person after you've seen or heard this thing. And I don't think that happens in the same way when we're just consuming through digital feeds.
I think you're right, and I think it's also tied to the political state of things, and the kind of societal state of play. I think back to the mid-90s and the young British artists movement with Damien Hirst and
Yeah,
Tracy
Hearst,
Emin,
yeah.
and just how radical and partisan and dividing that was in the best possible way in what you want art to be. And I remember I interviewed Gary Mansfield, who was a guy who spent 15 years in prison, and he turned his life around in prison by encountering art and writing to the young British artists. And most of them got back to him with their monologues. And so this became his study time in prison. And he just found such belonging in the identity and self-expression that since he's got out, he's just, he's curated all these shows. He does a lot of youth work now with young people to help them find self-expression. Incredible story. But he really made me laugh when he said, I remember saying about Damien Hirst, and he said, I remember seeing the dead cow head piece, and when I was in prison, and he said, I remember showing it to the teacher of the art class and saying, "There's a guy in D Wing who's in for something like that."
Yeah. I mean, art can be transgressive in that way. Like the YBAs were shocking and polarizing, and like blew past boundaries, like social boundaries that people expected art to follow. And that's what made them great. That's what makes that work still look, intense and meaningful today.
But that's what came out of the Thatcherism in Britain. It was a kind of turning of the tide in it. I think it began to happen as there was a little more optimism and people began to find a more collective voice. That Britpop, there was a number of cultural movements where that happened. So I hope that we can find that in these incredibly divisive times. We talked about it at the beginning of this chat, what you're experiencing with the election in the US right now. We just had it in the UK. We've got riots in the streets. I want to get those people into culture. I want them to find their thing and their voice because they sorely need it. It's plain to see. And, but you felt a part of that. There was this upsurge of culture that echoed it, and I think everyone just felt, maybe not everyone, that's a broad statement, but a lot of people felt a little more optimistic about their lives and their capacity to do something that was theirs.
Yeah, finding this new voice, like even though you're not making the art necessarily, or you might just be seeing the museum exhibition or whatever, but you feel swept along by it. You feel like you're in a new era and you have the sense of belonging or identity because these artists are making things that speak so directly to you and your moment. And in that context, like what it was to be British and young and disaffected in the 90s, like that's what it was. Like that work speaks so clearly. And I don't know what that is nowadays necessarily. I mean, I think people are hungry for that. They're hungry for art that they feel represents them and gives them a stronger voice. But I also, that capacity of art to shock is less tolerated now. I mean, I don't think cancel culture is such a huge phenomenon, but there is this pressure to stay within the lines of political discourse and to not be too personally or politically transgressive. And that prevents some work like the YBAs. I mean, they were problematic people who made problematic art, and that's why it's memorable. I think there is a sense that we want artists, or there's some desire for artists to just be normal people, to essentially be celebrities, like a Hollywood actor. And that's not what artists are or should be. Like, they're not acceptable people. They're not just making things that make you feel comfortable and chill or whatever. They're making things that might upset you, and that's the point.
Absolutely. Yeah, triggers discourse, and it's wonderful. And yeah, we do need that. We need more Bukowskis, for all these flaws.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in literature now, I mean, the publishing industry is facing this huge problem of not finding new strong voices and not highlighting and supporting authors who don't have that content capital, who don't fit easily into that frame of what is seen as successful. And people are really hungry for powerful writing and voices and challenging things. And I think there's something about the market and the ecosystem that doesn't deliver it.
Very much so. Well, look, I've kept you for quite a while, Kyla. I appreciate it. It's been really, really good. As a sign off, I wanted to just quickly touch upon what kind of conscious actions do you think that us, I guess both us as creators and us as consumers, can start to take to kind of break through this? I mean, I guess the obvious first step is awareness, and I think your book does a wonderfully rounded job of framework for where we are right now. But then, as a launch pad from there, uh, is it working harder to find stuff that's not being given to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think being aware, as you said, is like being understanding when you're being fed something or automatically recommended something by technology that's not necessarily your deepest interest. Like knowing when you're in that, I don't know, black hole of a TikTok feed or a Spotify autoplay and just getting out of it. Like pulling the escape lever when you're in that zone and logging off and doing something else. I think that's a great step. And then yeah, I mean, to me it's hard to discover things, it's hard to find new stuff. Algorithmic recommendations are good for finding new things and getting introduced to new things, but the more important step is what you do afterward. Like when you find a new musician, don't just fave it on Spotify and expect it to come back to you. Learn something about them, learn what their previous albums were, go back through their discography, maybe try to buy the album from them directly so that they can continue their careers. Like take that next step to get closer to the artist and to understand more about where they're coming from. Like that will make the ecosystem better, that will make your experience of the art better. And just, I mean, to me, the algorithmic ecosystem online has supplanted so much conversation and person-to-person recommendation about culture that we can also just reclaim that and talk more with each other about what we're enjoying and work harder to introduce our friends to new music or a cool podcast that you listen to or go see a museum exhibition together. I feel like somehow we have that discourse around television and film right now, like that's very active, but it's much less active in terms of music or art or literature. Like we can all participate in those conversations a lot more than we do already. I keep my metaphor that I keep coming back to for what should happen is like we need a farmer's market of culture rather than the big box Walmart store of culture. Like Spotify is a faceless big box retailer that is not going to bring you more value. It's just there to sell you the most stuff the fastest. But if we think of it more like a farmer's market where we're going directly to the artists, we're paying them directly, we're knowing where our culture comes from and having a direct line to it, I think that would be much healthier. And it's more interesting when you do have that interaction with the artist, when you know where they're coming from, how they're developing their career, like maybe they're geographically closer to you. Maybe you see them in a coffee shop or like go to a pop-up jewelry show at a boutique. Like any movement toward that more human to human ecosystem is going to be infinitely more valuable than clicking on another thing on the internet. This simply put, go do something, go connect with someone, go seek out the sources of what you like, and everything will be better.
Yeah. And the same applies to us as creators. You just have to flip that backwards because it's invariably every time I have a quiet spell, when I get back to direct emailing and rejuvenating conversations with people, things happen. If I just post on social media, things don't tend to happen because again, it's the algorithm is the barrier between us as the creator and the consumer, isn't it? And even if we just have a small network online that has the people we really know and love in it, it's still withheld somewhat to percentages. So I think going direct and making the effort to build those relationships and share what we're making with people has the same effect.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, I think the digital platforms and social media has become this layer of mediation between people, and it's not good for us. It doesn't have our best interests at heart. It is certainly not driving the culture forward in a direction that we find appealing. And so you have to go direct. You have to, and I think it's also important to note that it doesn't have to be offline. Like, the internet is not inherently bad. I think email lists and newsletters and small scale podcasts and Patreons and all of that stuff does enable a more direct transaction between consumer and creator, or vice versa. So you can find that stuff online really easily. You just have to get off the kind of highway and go toward the smaller areas and the more obscure platforms. And then you might find yourself in a chat room with your favorite new musician or something, or like interacting with a cool DJ or whatever. And that's better.
Yeah, I agree completely. And my little recommendation, you might already be aware, but the Blind Boy podcast is a great example of that. And it's just incredibly niche, and the topics are just, you could never predict what he's going to come up with next. The topic of his monologues, one of them was the history of bootcut jeans, and it's tremendous. Like he ended up getting into the history of denim and dyeing in Africa, and it really went back. But it's beautiful, and he's over 1 million listenership now. He's been featured in the New York Times, but completely independently using Patreon and just the sheer love of his eccentricity with his audience, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So it is possible.
Yeah, it's completely possible. It's like you want to find the voice that appeals to you the most and connect with it in the most direct way possible. Like that. If we follow those two rules, I think we find our way to stuff like that and start building a better ecosystem.
Well, this has been a joy, Kyle. Thank you ever so much for your time, and congrats on the book, and I hope it continues to do well for you.
Thank you. This was a great conversation.
I'm still kind of in awe that I get these people, that I get the Aaron Rileys of TBWA, and I get the Kyle Chaykas coming to talk to me on my show, because a big part of me, and this is a conscious decision, to retain the joy of the industry and not give in to habituation, which is kind of, losing that appreciation of something that was once magic but becomes your norm no matter how good it is. It's hard to feel the same love. But I retain my teenage art college self when I was just in sheer awe of the industry, and I fantasized about one day being in it. I want to keep that part of myself forever. So there is a big part of that guy still in here. And what that means is those guys, the Kyles and the Erins, are still very much on a pedestal. So it does blow my mind a little bit when I see that they've come to my show, and I feel very honoured about that. So thank you to Kyle Chayka for taking the time to do that. The guy's the staff writer for the New Yorker. Shouldn't be here. Should be off with Debbie Millman. Well, maybe he is as well, and she's got better numbers. But who's counting? I'm very, very happy about that. Thank you guys for listening. It means a lot. Like I said at the start of the show, if you're new, welcome. Familiarise yourself with the massive archive and Spotify and Apple Podcasts now. There's so much to get your teeth into, and I've always been conscious not to create content that is too time sensitive, because the idea was always that I want to leave a lifetime legacy, an archive of creative exploration that people for generations and lifetimes to come, way beyond my lifetime, can still access this stuff and learn how to love and embrace and maximize their creativity. So I'm doing the website at the minute, the Creative Condition website, and that's going to be a major launch, because it's finally going to be the home for this decade plus exploration of human creativity, which has sustained me for all this time. I'm in love with it. I think I always will be. It just gets more and more fun. So I'm going to have a brand new website. It's going to have the podcast there. It's going to have a shop. It's going to have the books, the Anatomy of Creativity map. It's going to have quotes. It's going to have exclusive interviews. It's going to have a library of resources for recommended books. What I want from this thing, and for any of you who listened to last week's episode about my vision, will recognize that I am essentially building what I talked about in the vision, which is this massive home of creativity. It's a hub. People come there, people buzz, people love to learn and feed off each other and just be creative and treat it like art school. And of course, I can't afford a massive industrial building in the heart of town, like I mentioned, but what I can do is work backwards from that utopian vision, and I can build it digitally and use that digital home to engineer my access to those big, beautiful, grandiose educational spaces. And maybe one day I'll work with people who want to invest in this belief of mine of creativity to make those physical homes reality. Who knows? But I'm loving that there's a website coming. It's going to finally give more credence to this podcast, my book, The Creative Condition, which you can grab now at bentalonwriter.com/shop, and everything in between. And I'm so happy about that. I'm even going to get to use those very early interviews with the likes of Stephen Merchant and Danny Dyer that I did for Calm on the Express campaign. You know, that's really exciting to me, and I'm loving building it at the moment. I'm having to fight myself back from not spending too much time doing it when I also need to be an illustrator for the most of the week. So thanks again to Kyle Chayka for coming on the show. So many good episodes coming up. I need to get recording a few more now. Time is going to be ticking. I've been holding off recording while I'm building the website because I've got a few in the bag, but they're running out. But they're coming up, and they always are. There's always people bubbling, ready to go. So going to be doing that. Thanks, guys. I hope you've got an awesome creative week ahead. Thank you to the founding sponsor of the show. This wouldn't be possible without them. Go check out their wonderful work for the creative industry and their bank of illustrators and animators and art directors and all sorts in between. illustrationx.com. Support the Ukrainian Institute, ui.org.ua. That's about it from me. Cheers, guys. Stay creative. Have an awesome week.